Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. Today's subject is another one of those subjects that really doesn't seem to get talked about enough in the hobby, but I feel it's something that everybody should know, or at very least be aware of, because I think it's actually quite an important topic. Anyway, I recently made some changes to this 28-year-old natural aquarium. I basically decided to take the tank from what's always been a very low maintenance tank to what I sort of rather comically described as an ultra low maintenance tank. Now, in order to do this, I just tried to simplify and tweak a few things in the tank, and most notably I decided to remove some of the very fast growing plants, i.e. the ambulia you see here, the beautiful feathery plant. This has always grown fantastically well in this tank, but because of that it needed constant trimming, so I decided to remove that. I've also removed the guppy grass you see here, which in a similar vein, it grew extremely well, but I was forever having to thin it out and trim it. Apart from this, I've also made a few other sort of minor tweaks to the tank. Two most notable ones, I actually also replaced the pump. The old pump on this tank was extremely old and really just sort of limping along, so I put a new pump in which has given the tank a little bit more flow and slightly better gas exchange, but it's still only turning the tank over sort of 2-3 times an hour at most. And the final thing that I sort of changed at a similar time was I've actually started to feed my fish a little bit more than I was. The main reason for this is I felt some of the plants looked a little bit on the hungry side in the tank, and as all the nutrients in this tank actually just come from fish food, the simplest way of giving the plants a little bit more food is simply to give the fish a little bit more. But I must stress it is only a little bit more. It's not suddenly sort of quadrupling the amount of food or anything. It's just a little bit extra. So anyway, now that I've removed the very fast growing stem plants from this tank, I'm really solely relying, or mainly relying, on the water lettuce to actually remove nutrients from the water and then actually remove those plants. And this is basically what's enabled me to keep this tank running since 2010 without any water changes, and it's necessary to always be removing things in order to do this. Well, the good news is it's now been a few weeks since I made these changes, and I've tested out all the water parameters, the TDS, the nitrate, the phosphate, everything is normal, and everything is all good. There's no sudden impact or anything, so by making the changes, by removing the fast growing plants that I had in here, it hasn't had a negative effect on the tank. And in actual fact, the fish themselves have actually had a little bit of time to get used to the tank as well, because the tank is now that little bit more open. It took them a little while to kind of get used to it, and now in actual fact they're feeding much more boldly than they were previously. They're really quite a lot less nervous, and they're actually almost feeding out of my hand now, so they're really kind of settled and really quite happy, as it were. Anyway, at a personal sort of level, I'm really kind of enjoying this sort of somewhat more refined look. Kind of makes the tank, dare I say it, almost look a little bit more sort of aquascaped than a normal tank. But one of the reasons I wanted to actually do this was really to show that natural style tanks, they don't always have to be kind of all overgrown and jungly. You can actually do a little bit more aquascaping with them if you want to, and keep them a little bit more orderly, shall I say. Anyway, I'm sure you're asking now, so what effect did all these sort of changes actually have on the plants in the tank? You know, they were all quite minor changes, but nevertheless they were all changes to the environment one way or another. Well, in actual fact, it's really quite surprising, and it's not entirely what I expected. It's quite interesting how, even after all these years, you think you know exactly what's going to happen when you change something in a tank. But no, tanks love to throw you just a slightly curveball. Nothing too drastic, but not exactly what I expected. Anyway, I'll firstly go through the ones that I expected, as it were, and that's basically the cryptocorynes you see growing all the way along the front of the tank here. Now, those of you that are aware or familiar with cryptocorynes will have heard of something called cryptocorine melt. Basically because cryptocorynes are notorious for, if you change something in the environment, the leaves start to melt away and actually die on the plants, and they can do this on really, or after really quite subtle changes. So it's no great surprise after tweaking 3 or 4 different things on the tank that some of the leaves have actually melted. And what you can actually see here is that what's happened is the older leaves on the tank have actually melted away, and in a way, it's kind of done me a bit of a favour, because what it's actually done is it's naturally thinned the plants out a little bit, which is in a way saved me a bit of work, because sooner or later I would have had to have done this by hand or cut them back anyway. So that's really quite normal and to be expected, as it were. Anyway, so why have they actually done this? Well, the reason they've done this is that the old leaves were actually grown in different conditions, and all those little tweaks that I made to the tank and removing different things, changing the flow and what have you, basically have changed the conditions. And those old leaves, they're not adapted to these new conditions. And it basically means that those leaves, they no longer function efficiently for the plant. So they're really of little or no use to the plant. So the plants just simply choose to drop them in favour of growing new ones, which will then obviously be adapted to the new environment, as it were. And it's quite an interesting thing how different plants do it in different ways. As I say, cryptocoryons are notorious for this sort of gently melting away. And if you change something too drastically, with some species, the actual whole plant will melt away. It won't just be the old leaves. So you have to be quite careful. But you'll find other plants do similar things, but they tend to react in slightly different ways. Some stem plants, for example, if you change things in the environment, will quite suddenly drop old leaves. And generally everyone thinks, oh, they've just shaded themselves out. But sometimes it's simple enough that the environment has actually changed. It's not necessarily just that they've got a little bit less light going to them. It can be that there's less flow, although the less flow can be simply because the plant's got thicker and it's preventing the flow. But it gets rather complicated, as you can probably guess. Anyway, the reason is basically the same. If you change something in the tank, expect to get some reaction somewhere along the line. Just as an example, if you clean your filter out and you haven't done it for a while and you suddenly get a change of flow, you may well find that some plants start to drop some of their leaves really quite suddenly, and some take a little bit longer, a couple of weeks or something like that. But interestingly, they do lots of different things. The ambulia that you see here that I showed earlier actually does quite a strange thing. If you change something in the environment, it actually suddenly stops growing, and it tends to actually, it doesn't die, but what it does, it actually aborts that growth point. That growth point stops growing, and then it goes sideways. It actually branches out. It's quite strange. Obviously that new growth point doesn't like the change of conditions, and then the plant has to react by growing out in a different way. But basically you'll find every species reacts in a different way to these sort of changes, so it's always something to look out for. And of course there are always a few plants which are incredibly resilient. Things like Java ferns seem pretty impervious unless you do something really crazy and change something enormously. They're just very, very tough. Incidentally, on that kind of subject, if you do a really big sudden water change, especially if you haven't done one for a very long while, this has the ability to suddenly shift your water parameters, and that is especially bad for your plants. And if you do that, as I say, really drastically, it can be so bad that it actually shifts the chemistry, and this will actually affect your fish as well quite negatively. So be very careful of doing big sudden changes, especially if you've not done one for a long while. If you're doing water changes, little and often is definitely safer. As I say, the most important thing really here is stability is the name of the game. So the more stable you can keep everything, the better your tank will run, just the better everything kind of functions at the end of the day. As I say, basically anything which fluctuates has the potential to mess things up. And it's not just things like the water chemistry. As I say, it can be things like the lighting. For example, if you suddenly put a new bulb on your tank or a new LED strip, you can suddenly give your plants sort of twice as much light. And to some degree, that may be what happened in this tank, because when I thinned out a lot of those stem plants, a lot more light got to the cryptocoryons, and that may well have contributed to it. As I say, also the flow is something which makes quite a difference. But one of the weird things or strange things that a lot of people don't realise is that if you let a tank get very overgrown, it completely changes the flow pattern of your tank. And then when you suddenly cut plants down, the flow pattern changes again. And this can have a negative effect on the plants that are still in the tank, and especially things like cryptocoryons. So even with pruning, the best thing is definitely to just keep doing a little bit regularly, rather than kind of all or nothing sort of thing, as it were. Same goes for filters. Don't let your filter get really clogged up and then suddenly clean it so that you suddenly get a massive amount more flow. They're all things that, as I say, cause changes which basically can alter the way things react. And basically what happens is that the changes in flow, what it does is it alters the way that plants receive nutrients, CO2, oxygen, etc., and also how they're able to get rid of waste products. And this is one of the reasons that causes them to react in this sort of negative way. It's just one of those things that happens, and a lot of people don't really realise why. But I can't stress enough that stability is really by far the most important thing. And I think honestly, if you ask me what were the two things I've learned more than anything else over the 28 years of this tank in particular, and that is stability and patience. I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to maintain this carpet of Cryptocoryne wentii along the bottom of the tank here for literally 28 years if the tank hadn't remained really quite stable. Anyway, I'm going a little bit off topic here, but going back to the plants, the biggest surprise on this tank has actually been the moss. The spiky moss in the tank has actually gone really quite crazy. And as you can see, it's actually now all the way along the bottom of the tank here, and it's mingling beautifully with all the cryptocorynes. And I'd normally associate mosses with being, slow growing or steady growing at best, but this one is almost fast at the moment, and it's really been quite a surprise. It's almost as though the moss is taking up the nutrients that the actual ambulia and the guppy grass in particular were taking up, which I find a little bit hard to believe, but it's certainly growing extremely quickly. And it is something which I'm sure if any of you watched the previous video will remember, I actually wanted to recreate the sort of moss carpet at this end of the tank, partly because I think it looks wonderful and it makes the tank absolutely glow, but it's also fantastic little sort of hatchery for your fish, and also for the little sort of microfauna and things. It protects those so the baby fish and the other fish in the tank get a little bit more natural food. But I just think it looks fantastic, not only from sort of close up, but actually it looks great from a distance as well. It's kind of magical. I really like it, but it wasn't something I expected to happen sort of quite that quickly, as it were. But as so often with these kind of tanks, you just have to go with the flow. That's fine. That's just the way things pan out. And to be honest, that's one of the greatest secrets of natural aquaria. If something's really thriving, then go with it. It's always a good policy. And it's mainly because these are the plants that are really genuinely helping your tank the most. They're giving your tank the most sort of benefit, as they're the ones that are helping to reduce the nutrients and things in your tank. But like most things, you can have a little bit too much of a good thing, and there are already some areas where the moss is actually almost crowding out the cryptocorynes a little bit too much, so I may do a little bit thinning out. Anyway, those of you that actually saw the original sort of ultra low maintenance video, you may recall that I sort of rather unceremoniously pinned a bit of this moss to the back of the tank. Well, it kind of worked and it didn't. It grew into the most beautiful ball, and then actually it kind of fell off, which is actually this nice big ball you can see underneath here. But there is actually still a little bit sort of stuck under the drawing pin that does look as though it might be starting to grow on the back of the tank. So the jury's still out, so I'm going to leave it a little bit longer, but I may actually end up trying a different moss anyway. But as with often happens with a lot of strange things in tanks, is that in actual fact there is a little bit of ordinary Java moss that has actually attached itself on its own to the back of the tank. It's kind of typical. You try and do it yourself and it doesn't work, and then nature just does it for you. But that's fine. I like the way that goes. And in actual fact there is also a little bit of that moss actually growing on the wood here. It's a little bit wiry at the moment, but it's actually attached again of its own accord. So I'll probably run with that as well, and I'll give that a little bit of a trim, because that will help to sort of thicken it up and get it to grow a bit better. But on the subject of the back of the tank, actually, I would like to try and deliberately grow a few more things on the back. I'm actually contemplating trying a few things like bucephalandras, which I've never really tried in this tank, so that might be an interesting little experiment for the future. Anyway, back to topic, as it were. One of the things that I'd actually really expected to happen, when I removed the fast-growing plants, I thought, well, something's got to take up the slack, and the obvious candidate for that was the water lettuce, the floating plant here. And mainly because water lettuce, because its leaves are out of the tank, it has access to atmospheric CO2, so it's not limited in any way by CO2, so they're able to suck up nutrients fantastically quickly. But to my surprise, while the water lettuce is growing, just as well as it always was, I don't honestly think the growth has changed. I think it's growing about the same, and that's considering that there is a little bit more fish food going in. So that's definitely a bit of a surprise. I mean, I'm still removing a good chunk of it each week just to sort of keep it in check, but that's infinitely more straightforward than having to keep trimming the ambulia and the guppy grass anyway. So I'm quite happy to do that. Anyway, as far as the other plants in the tank are concerned and how they've kind of reacted or changed to these sort of changes in environment, the crinum on the left here, this crinkled onion, that definitely seems to be growing a little bit more strongly. The new leaves are definitely coming out a little bit faster, and they appear to be getting a bit broader and a bit stronger. So I'm quite pleased about that, although it looks as though it probably isn't going to flower this year, which is a bit of a shame because that's something I'd really love to show you. But they normally flower end of February, so it's getting a bit kind of late for that now. So I think we may have to wait another year on that. And then the Amazon sword here on the right-hand side of the tank, sort of similar result really. It definitely seems to be growing that little bit better, but nothing that significant. It's just that little bit stronger, but it's growing nicely and it's lovely and green, so I'm quite pleased with that. The only plant that seems to be sort of slightly flagging is the tiger lotus, but I suspect that doesn't actually have anything to do with this because the tiger lotus is a seasonal growing plant, and it's probably actually just coming towards the end of its season. They tend to go dormant in the spring and the summer, so I think its sort of less strong growth is probably more tuned to that more than anything else. So anyway, I'm sure you're kind of asking, so what actually caused the cryptocorynes and things to actually melt in that way and maybe the moss grow faster, etc.? Was it simply that the tank had got more flow, more light, less competition from the fast-growing plants, maybe less alliopathy, better gas exchange, better water circulation? Well, I'm afraid the honest answer is it's almost impossible to actually pin things down to any particular thing. The simple reason being that every one thing you change tends to have a knock-on effect of 2 or 3 different things, so it's very hard to actually pin things down. And quite honestly, the variables are absolutely endless. But the one thing you can pretty much bet your life on is that even really quite small changes, really of pretty much anything, have the ability to actually have a negative effect on your plants. Admittedly, some more than others, but it's certainly something to be aware of if you find a plant suddenly starts to dropping leaves or doing something strange. And the real lesson here is absolutely that stability is king, especially when it comes to sort of long-term plant health. And I'm sure this is basically how I've managed to keep this tank for 28 years, and especially some of the plants like the cryptocorynes that have been in here since day one, as it were. It's very hard to maintain plants long-term without good basic stability. And whenever you change something, plants have a really hard time transitioning, and it's something that takes time. Whereas algae, on the other hand, is actually able to take advantage really quickly, because what algae is able to do is it's able to go into reproductive mode almost instantly. So not only when you change things does it basically handicap the plants and cause them to have to grow out new leaves for the new environment, but it also leaves the door open for algae. So it's one of those things really to be aware of, and it's probably one of the best reasons actually for trying to keep things stable. Keep your plants healthy, and not only do they help to suppress algae, but the stability itself doesn't open the door for a sudden algal bloom, and certainly not in the same way, and certainly a lot less likely. So if you'd like to know more about my naturally balanced, no water changed, unfertilised aquariums, I'd be eternally grateful if you subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists here, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.